I wish I'd stirred this.
And action.
Not good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to English 332. I am your host, Professor Matt Cohen, and this, my friends, is the birth of the American novel.
Action.
I have to say thank you to my brother for operating the camera and for his editing wizardry. That's Dan Cohen behind the scenes. He's pretty cute, but guess who's super cute? My mom, who I caught making cookies in the bathroom because she didn't want the noise of the blender to disturb our video. My mom is the best. Welcome to Dark Utopias. On that first slide, you will see my office hours. They are very important. Come see me.
That's better.
Okay.
Action.
What? But we already...
Right. More action.
Dude, this is an English class. There's only going to be so much action. Sorry, y'all. If you want some action, throw your copy of the book across the room. Imperium and Imperio by Sutton Griggs. In your next slide, you'll see a picture of our author. Sutton Griggs lived from 1872 to 1933. We are moving into the part of the semester where we have to grapple with the transformations in genre and style that happened in the world of the novel in the wake of the industrialization of printing and distribution. And, in a word, of the entire enterprise of creating fiction as it was transformed by these forces. Remember that more people read Charlotte Temple in the 19th century than they did in the 1700s when it was published. A mass audience for fiction can only be said to have come into being in the 19th century, and that's the kind of thing that made authors like Sutton Griggs think that the novel could make some real changes in the world, that it could reach a whole bunch of people if it could just engage them in the right ways and transform their ways of thinking about major issues. In this case, the question of race. This presence of a mass audience makes new demands on how we understand the reputation and the formal features of the novel in the 19th century. One of the key questions is, how do we study fiction in the light of a mass audience? As we saw with Lepard and the industrialization of print, more pages were being printed at lower cost than ever before, and distribution into areas that were previously untouched by anything but Bibles and hymn books was increasingly the norm. Thanks to public schooling and the slow expansion of the number of colleges and universities, increasingly large percentages of people were literate in the United States after the Civil War, and this included second and third generations of immigrants, as well as black folks in the South newly able to learn to read and write in the wake of emancipation, because there had been laws against literacy prior to that for slaves. If the novel served the nationalizing and moralizing, or both, interests of one particular class, the middle class, like we talked about last time, in the 18th and early 19th century, and if it made its appeal in the years before the Civil War, by struggling with national or international issues such as politics and reform in Hawthorne, for example, or national expansion and slavery in Lepard, how do we deal with the novel when it's being read potentially by millions of people with very different interests and investments and backgrounds living in different parts of the country? Sutton Griggs is, of course, not the first African-American novelist. William Wells Brown's Clotel is the first known African-American authored novel. That was from 1853. Martin Delany, Harriet Wilson, Frank Webb, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, all of these folks wrote novels before Griggs. But Griggs is part of a post-emancipation explosion of fiction writing by minorities more broadly, and by black people specifically. Griggs was a college-educated Baptist minister who was born in Texas and a longtime resident of Tennessee. He created his own publishing company in order to get his 5 novels out to the world. Much of his work was sold by way of the black church in which he worked, or it was sold door to door. Although his work was not widely read during his lifetime, Griggs would later be recovered by African-American literary scholars, and his work now enjoys more prominence than it ever has before. The rise in fiction writing that Griggs participated in was part of a larger literary flowering. It was part of a larger set of political movements that were being made by black people entering politics in the nation in an unprecedented way. All of this is context for Griggs's novel, so that's going to be the main subject of my lecture today. But first, I want to get a few things about Griggs's style out on the table, because this book is written a little bit unlike the ones we have looked at before. For example, Griggs alternates between comedic scenes and serious ones, sometimes very rapidly. It's a very readable book. It's got a lot of dialogue. It's got a fast-moving plot, framed by the tandem biographies of Belton and Bernard. The structure of the novel plays out along the lines of the struggle for racial equality in the United States, but it is also careful to draw its main characters very deeply. So you get the big picture framing, but then you also get a real sense of what these men are like and what is driving them, what their backgrounds were. So we understand how important the conflict is between these two men over the question of whether black efforts at equality should happen within American law, or whether instead they should proceed by any means necessary. Now, Griggs, for the most part, also uses straightforward language and simple phrasings, but as you notice, he does make use of one feature that we talked about last time, that is dialect writing. The opening scenes, for example, featuring Belton's mother, are written in a heavy Southern black dialect. So it can feel at first like we're getting a stereotypical picture of a poor Southern black family here, even though, of course, Belton will grow up to become a complex and influential character. But I would argue that something more sophisticated is happening with this use of style. Early in the novel, only the African-American characters are depicted in dialect, and it's the uneducated generation that is trying to get the next generation, the Beltons and Bernards, into school, trying to get them educated, trying to make them powerful figures in culture. They're the only ones, the people who are urging education are the only ones who are depicted using dialect. But by the end of the novel, none of the black characters are depicted using that dialect, but the poor Southern white supremacists are. And in this way, I think Griggs is using style to help underscore his main argument that education is essential for improving the lives of African Americans, even as he undermines the use of stereotypical dialect by white writers by turning it against white Southern characters. After all, the depiction of speech is fundamental to this novel, given that its two main characters, right, they are orators. And this brings us to that interesting formal feature of the novel, the way in which the author handles describing this main talent by which Belton and Bernard rise to fame. We get careful descriptions of their persuasive abilities in public speaking, but until the very end of the novel, with a confrontation in the arena of the Imperium, we don't actually read anything that they say in these amazing oratorical performances. By holding off on a full detailing of their skills, Griggs heightens the impact of the last part of the novel, turning what could be an uninteresting, lengthy set of statements into a suspenseful, dramatic contest of two visions of how black folks should address American racism and white supremacism. Griggs's novel, as this final showdown shows, has a complex relationship to utopia as a social vision, and it's one different from Hawthorne's view, as filtered through his main character, Coverdale. The large framework for the story is set up through the two black intellectuals, Bernard Belgrave and Belton Piedmont. The obvious reference here, though it's not completely a parallel, is to the relationship between the two leading black intellectuals of the time Griggs was writing in the end of the 19th century, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. A look at these men and what they stood for will help establish some of the crucial context for understanding what Griggs is up to in this novel. Take a look at your next slide. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was a civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, sociologist, historian, author, and editor. He's one of the most revered figures in African American history and one of the most controversial. He was the first African American graduate of Harvard University. He studied sociology in Chicago and in Germany, and he became a professor of history and economics at Atlanta University. He headed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1910, and in his still popular book, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois offered the term double consciousness, which has become tremendously influential as a way of understanding the position of racialized subjects in the United States. In order to survive a racist United States, others have had to maintain a double sense of themselves at all times. A sense of oneself as seen or evaluated by whites in power, so stereotypes, objects, legally differentiated subjects, And then on the other hand, a sense of oneself as an individual, as a human being with a sense of individuality, uniqueness. Du Bois explains in the next slide, "The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He does not wish to Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He would not bleach his Negro blood in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face." Du Bois rose to national attention in his opposition to Booker T. Washington's ideas of social integration between blacks and whites. Du Bois campaigned for increased political representation for blacks in order to guarantee civil rights, and advocated the formulation of a black elite, something that he termed the talented 10th, that would work for the progress of the African American race. These folks would be college trained, they would become experts in their fields, and they would, in various ways across the disciplines, but also through political offices, become leaders taking charge. Kind of a federalist vision of African Americanism. And take a look at your next slide. Booker Tolliver Washington was a political leader, educator, orator, and author. He was the dominant figure in the African American community in the United States from 1890 to 1915. Washington was born into slavery to a white father and a slave mother in a rural area of southwestern Virginia. After emancipation, he worked in West Virginia in a variety of manual labor jobs before making his way to Hampton Roads seeking an education. He worked his way through what is now known as Hampton University, and he attended seminary at Wayland. After returning to Hampton as a teacher, in 1881 he was named the first leader of the new Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Now Washington, and actually on the right there you can see one of his speaking tours, and if you look at the timetable on there, you will see this guy is giving dozens and dozens and dozens of talks within the space of just a few days, right? Traveling all across the boonies, talking to folks in backwater Virginia about his ideas about how race should be handled in the United States. And he got to this status as a speaker by giving an address called the Atlanta Address in 1895, which attracted the attention of politicians and the public. He was a popular spokesperson for African American citizens after that. Sounds a little bit like what happens in Imperium and Imperio, for example. Washington built a nationwide network of supporters in many black communities, with black ministers, educators, and businessmen composing his core supporters. Washington's efforts included cooperating with white people and enlisting the support of wealthy philanthropists, which helped to raise funds to establish and operate thousands of small community schools and institutions of higher education for the betterment of blacks throughout the South. His emphasis was on industrial education or technical education. After 1909, Washington was criticized by the leaders of the new NAACP, especially Du Bois, who demanded a harder line on civil rights protests. Washington replied that confrontation would lead to disaster for the outnumbered blacks, and that cooperation was the only way to move forward with supportive whites if you wanted to overcome pervasive racism in the long run. His autobiography, Up From Slavery, which was published in 1901, is perhaps his most famous work. Now, why was this controversy so heated? Surely we can kind of ask, from the benefit of hindsight, it's good to have both intellectual leaders and technically skilled folks working in white-dominated industries. Well, the immediate context for this controversy is the Reconstruction-era South and the racial violence that it witnessed. So we're going to turn back time a little bit to take a look at the era of Jim Crow. Take a look at your next slide. So, Reconstruction. After the Civil War ended in 1865, radical changes to the political landscape of the United States happened. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, were adopted between 1865 and 1870. This group of amendments is sometimes referred to as the Civil War Amendments or the three Reconstruction-era amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, 1865. The 14th Amendment, in 1868, included the Privileges or Immunities Clause, Due Process, and Equal Protection Clauses. This overturned the notion that blacks were aliens, in essence, declaring them citizens of the United States. And then the 15th Amendment, in 1870, granted citizens voting rights regardless, as it quoted, of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Sounds like a great advance. Sounds like something that should have happened a long time before. It was actually the first time that citizenship was defined in the United States. But here's the thing. Despite these laws, social practice worked against racial equality, as white Americans re-solidified nationalism and their patriotism around a white versus colored binary difference. Economically, too, the establishment of the sharecropping system kept Southern blacks in a state of debt to white landowners, limiting their economic clout. Under sharecropping, basically the land would be leased to farmers, black and white, and in effect, you would have to borrow your money for your seed and for your manure and everything else from those folks, right? So 1 or 2 bad years and all of a sudden you're in debt and there's no way for you to get out of it. In literature, dialect fiction, nostalgic stories about life before the Civil War, like Gone with the Wind in this picture, these are the descendants of this era's reconsolidation of white supremacy. These stories propagated a myth of servile blacks and a natural aristocracy of white people. These fictions, like Gone with the Wind, were sometimes described as romances of reunion, and they often feature a white Southern woman marrying an elite Northern man. Look, honey, emancipation doesn't mean racial mixing. Thank heavens we can all just get along separately. Yeah. The control of black movement and the exercise of rights was only one of many fronts of the racial purification phenomenon. If you look at the next slide. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, and of course this era also saw the end of the Indian Wars in the West, as Indian removal and the reservation system were implemented through a series of increasingly violent massacres and assassinations by the U.S. Army. The massacre at Wounded Knee is perhaps the most famous of these. In the image here, you see the mass burials of Native people who were called enemy combatants by the Army in the wake of that conflict, most of whom, of course, were not combatants at all. We really begin to see this context of quasi-legal racial violence in the novel when Belton goes to Louisiana. And there's a bit of a game that's being played by Griggs in this section, right, in which Belton seems to have no idea that any of these laws against him traveling, for example, with white folks in the cars of the train have been enacted. He doesn't seem to realize how bad racism is in the Deep South, even though he attended school in Nashville with presumably black students from all over the region. But this is a rhetorical ploy on Griggs's part to denaturalize the violence of Jim Crow and heighten the sense of white inhumanity in contrast to Belton's and then eventually Bernard's educated universal perspective. So, what is Jim Crow? And where does all this stuff about the railroad and the Supreme Court case in that section of the novel come from? On June 7th, 1892, a 30-year-old colored shoemaker named Homer Plessy was jailed for sitting in the white car of the East Louisiana Railroad. Plessy was only 1/8 black and 7/8 white, but under Louisiana law he was considered black, and therefore required to sit in the colored car. Plessy went to court and argued in Homer Adolph Plessy versus the State of Louisiana that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, those Reconstruction Amendments we were just talking about. Plessy was found guilty of refusing to leave the white car. He appealed to the Supreme Court of Louisiana, which, it will not surprise you, upheld the decision. In 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States heard Plessy's case and found him guilty once again. The Plessy decision set the precedent that separate facilities for blacks and whites were constitutional. Take a look at your next slide. Were constitutional as long as they were equal. The separate but equal doctrine was quickly extended to cover many other areas of public life: restaurants, theaters, restrooms, public schools, water fountains, as you see there. These laws, state and local, became collectively known as the Jim Crow laws. Some examples of Jim Crow laws are the segregation of public schools, public places, public transportation, restaurants. The U.S. military was also segregated. Such practices, as Griggs observes, could not be sustained without violence. There was, of course, no Ku Klux Klan before the Civil War. So, after the Jim Crow laws, lynching became increasingly common and widespread. I'm not going to show pictures of this because it makes some students feel uncomfortable, all kinds of good reasons not to, but you can of course look online if you want to confront a particularly ugly bit of your country's history. And to put it plainly, where I grew up in the South, right here, and there were places where it was worse, terrorism was commonplace. But in the images in your PowerPoint, these codified public segregation images, second-class citizenship that resulted from it, maybe you can kind of get a sense of just how much things have changed and what it is that Griggs was writing about and against. Take a look at your next slide. The first feature-length American film, The Birth of a Nation, exemplifies the tenor of the era with its glamorization of the KKK as a nation reunifying force that suppresses a supposedly ignorant, oversexed, violent, and greedy black population. Violence, voter intimidation, racist scientific and anthropological studies, preferential hiring, unequal practices of lending, a culture of mockery and stereotyping, a literature that presumed the natural, even scientized superiority of white people. That's Reconstruction-era America. Not until 1954, in the crucial Brown versus Board of Education decision, would the separate but equal doctrine be struck down. And it would take in essence another invasion of the South, and a host of civil rights efforts across the entire country to bring this decision into actual effect. College campuses were crucial places where this change was brought about. And in many ways, as you all know, from hiring practices to changing attitudes toward university admissions to the locations of neighborhoods, the realities of Jim Crow and systematic racism are still with us. Take a look at your next slide. So, to black people, America after the Civil War was in many ways a dystopia, not a utopia. The urge Griggs presents to separate from the Union, and the conflict between working within the system to correct it and working around or beyond or against it from the outside, these were serious and hard questions for black intellectuals everywhere. But I want to end just by noting that there are some hard questions you could ask about gender within the black community in this novel as well. Why is it that the female partners of the two main characters, Viola and Antoinette, have to either die or be left behind in order for these men to go on and become what they are? Remember Bernard's declaration here. The races whose union has been fraught with every curse known to earth and hell must separate. Viola demands it, and Bernard obeys. It was this that sent him forth to where kings were eager to court his favor. So, in short, no Viola suicide, no Imperium leader Bernard. This is true even though Viola came to her ideas about how the races need to never mix by reading a book that was in fact authored by a white supremacist. And even our hero Belton freaks out over his baby coming out white, and suddenly, despite Antoinette's complete devotion to him, fantasizes that she's been unfaithful to him and abandons her with a newborn. Now, the narrator punishes Belton for his faithlessness, remember that sentence, but the child continued to steadily grow darker and darker until he was a shade darker than his father. But who's punished worse than Antoinette? And who gets the living torture that she does? Here's how Belton leaves. Take a look at your next slide. It's a passage from chapter 19. He knows he's going to be put to death by the Imperium, about which presumably Antoinette knows nothing. And here's the scene. Then, too, he looked upon his boy and felt that his son would fill his place in the world. But Antoinette was so happy that he could not have the heart to tell her of his fate. She was a girl again. She chatted and laughed and played as though her heart was full of love. Very different from how, for example, Lydia Maria Child handled the role of women, and weirdly like how things turn out for the women in Blithedale Romance. There's a male-centricness to this novel that I think is worth wondering about. Of course, that's not the only thing that needs more discussion in this fascinating novel, and I look forward to reading your comments online. But for now, a quick preview of next week's novel, Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson. This short novel takes up some of the same issues about race and inequality that we saw in Griggs. It was published at around the same time as well. It uses dialect. It's got a strong humorous streak to it. But it's different in many ways. First of all, it goes back in time, returning to before the Civil War and emancipation and focusing on the life of a slave, Roxy. It also ends very differently, has a challenging, ironic couple of concluding pages that are among the most intensely analyzed in American literary studies. I'm excited to see what you all think about it. And be thinking about, as you read this novel, what Twain might be trying to tell us. And ask yourself, why would he set this novel in slavery times when he was writing in the 1890s, in the era of Jim Crow? What kind of meanings might that have created? And as always, we want to pay attention to what aspects of style and form are distinctive about Pudd'nhead Wilson. What are Mark Twain's kind of signature moves as a writer? This novel is funny, it is challenging, it's disturbing, and it's a classic example of the driving concerns of the American novel in its early years. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, people. I'll see you next time.
Action!
What the Good Lord, no. Really?
Yeah,
Net messages? Beware.
that was perfect.